Hey guys, welcome to Grad Coach TV, where we demystify and simplify the oftentimes confusing world of academic research. My name's David, and today I'm joined by one of our trusted coaches, Ruth, and we'll be discussing 5 of the common research limitations students often encounter. Today's discussion is based on one of the many articles over at the Grad Coach blog. So, if you'd like to get more information about research in general, or specifically the limitations, head over to our blog at gradcoach.com/blog. Also, if you're looking for a helping hand in your dissertation, thesis, or research project, be sure to check out our one-on-one private coaching service, where one of our coaches will be with you throughout the entire research journey, step by step. You can find out more information and book a free consultation with one of our friendly coaches at gradcoach.com. So hey Ruth, welcome to the Coachcast. It's great to have you here.
Thanks, David. It's great to be here again.
So today we're going to be talking about limitations in research, and probably one of the first ones you'll come across is limited access to information. Ruth, what can you tell us about this?
So absolutely, this is a big issue for a number of researchers. So especially when you're studying at a smaller institution where your university doesn't necessarily sign up for a large number of databases, there can often be an issue of not being able to access information. And so sometimes this is related to simply not being able to access because of paywalling. Other times it's because of the fact that, for example, literature that exists maybe have not been published in your own home language or the language that you understand or can read. And so it's unfortunately difficult, and you have to acknowledge the possibility that the gap that you think you've identified may actually have been addressed, but it may just not be relevant to you or apparent to you because of the fact that you haven't been able to access literature that actually does discuss the topic. To address this, though, I think one of the most important things you can do is to reach out to your local university librarian, your faculty help specialist, whatever the term that they're using at your university, but speak to the person in the library who knows about these things. And you'll be surprised at how often they can access interlending or access journals or access resources for you. It's often possible that there's budget for accessing papers that you just didn't know existed. And so it's entirely possible that, if you come across a study that you think you can't access, that the university can actually help you access. You just necessarily maybe weren't aware of it at the time. The second thing is the lack of existing literature. And so when we talk about this, we're not necessarily talking about the fact that you couldn't find anything on your first Google search. Sometimes there is actually very little literature on your topic. Keep in mind that this can be a good thing for your study because of the fact that if you're trying to fill a gap, especially at doctoral level, if you're trying to fill a gap, a lack of existing literature can really benefit you in this regard. However, if you suspect that there may be literature that's available that you just are not able to access, first make sure that you're not missing anything because you just did a quick search. So do multiple searches. Use various key terms, search terms, use Boolean operators, whatever you can to try and make sure that you're not missing out on any important information. And also, crucially, check the reference lists of especially any key papers that you can find. Reference lists are a gold mine because the people who are publishing papers that you're interested in regularly will reference or refer to key authors in your field. So that is actually a very helpful point to find out if perhaps you think you're missing something, but you're actually not. If, however, there is a lack of existing literature in your field, okay, and this can happen. So let's just say, for example, you are doing a study looking at the impact of working from home due to COVID on stress levels of employees in the UAE. It's entirely possible that given that the fact that COVID is a new thing, and not a lot of research necessarily has been done in the UAE, it's entirely possible that there actually is no research on this topic in the UAE. And so the best thing you can do on this, and when you're in a niche position like this, is to see what exists perhaps outside of your niche. So let's just say, for example, you are doing the study in the UAE. It's entirely possible and entirely likely that there are studies that have been done in, for example, America or UK. And so, even though these are not studies that are specifically situated in your research context, they can still help provide you with information on your topic in terms of the impact of working from home on stress levels. And so, it's important to remember that even if your topic is super niche, which is great, there's always the possibility that your topic has been explored maybe from a different geographical location, and that can help you and add to your literature search and reduce the limitation of saying, I've got no research, because it's possible that this research does exist just in a different country.
That's a great point, Ruth. One of the other limitations that we come across with limited access to information is simply limited access to data. It really can happen quite frequently that maybe you just don't have access to the data you're interested in. It's maybe behind a paywall. For instance, there's data that's been collected by a company. Another option would be for private companies if you're looking for things like profitability ratios. If they're not listed, it's really difficult to get that information.
Yeah.
So if you find that's the case, there are ways to address this. Probably the easiest way to do that is to consider alternative measures or surrogates for the data you want to compare. So for example, touching on what Ruth was talking about, if we're looking for data on stress related to remote working, given COVID's fairly new, we might not have specific data on that yet, but we do have quite a lot of data on general stress. And so you could look at that kind of data over the same time frame to get a tighter view on your topic. Also, you can chat to your supervisor. Often enough, they might have connections with specific companies or other academics, and they might be able to help you get access to data that you by yourself can't. The other thing you can do as well is apply for small grants. There's quite a range of them, and most of them are the world over. They supply everyone, and they're difficult to get, but you've got to apply, right? And that can be a nice small research grant that can give you just what you need to get to that data set.
Absolutely, David. And I think the most important thing with this is that if you've exhausted all of these options that we've mentioned and you still cannot access additional data or additional literature, then the point of the limitations section is to acknowledge where perhaps there were shortcomings. And so simply what you do then is you report it and you say that, for example, I was looking at stress levels of working from home employees due to COVID in the UAE. I could not find any other literature in any other languages using interlending, using multiple search terms, using different countries as a point of reference, then you simply report it. Remember, the limitations section is there for you to report on shortcomings. And if you can acknowledge that you've exhausted all your options, yet still you face this limitation, you simply acknowledge it, and then you just discuss how this might affect your results.
So our second limitation, and one that frequently comes up for pretty much every researcher, is time and cost limitations. No one has access to an unlimited budget or time. So Ruth, what can we do to address this?
Absolutely. And I think it's critical you mention that, because I think many researchers hope and believe that they'll have unlimited time and funds. Unfortunately, that's not how it works. So you have to account for this. And so, for example, if you were doing research on Olympic athletes and you were doing interviews on their performance in 2016, and you had planned to do follow-up studies at the 2020 Olympic Games, your study would necessarily have been impacted by the fact that there were no Olympics in 2020. And so you then had to extend by a year. And so if it didn't happen that you were allowed to extend your research by a year, you would have been a little bit stuck. And so what that would have had to have meant is that you would have had to have necessarily taken a cross-sectional approach. So there's always ways around this. And keeping in mind that within research, there's never one perfect way of doing research. You might have started doing longitudinal research and realize you cannot continue doing that. That's okay. That's absolutely okay. The most important thing is to keep in mind and to try and account for and address these issues before they arise. Now, no one could have predicted the COVID pandemic. However, if you know that you have to do research with people um, in Gauteng in December in South Africa, you need to account for the fact that a lot of these people are going to be in Durban or Cape Town or at the coast for their holidays. And so you need to therefore take into account the fact that your time plan might not work out because these people might not be around. So therefore you need to adjust your time plan to account for this. And so one of the things that you can do, firstly, planning is important, but one of the ways you can do this is by creating a Gantt chart and creating realistic deadlines for yourself. If necessary, depending on the level of research that you're doing, it's also possible that you can reduce the scope of your research. Everyone wants to change the world with their research, but depending on the project you're doing, it's entirely acceptable that perhaps you don't change the world. You add something new in whatever context you're doing, and that might mean that you're focusing more and you're reducing the scope to create a more focused scope. Related to this is the matter of cost. Research is very rarely without cost. If you were doing, for example, lab experiments, you might need to account for the fact that you have to buy lab equipment and repeatedly buy lab equipment if you were doing an experiment. Even if you're doing an online survey, you need to account for the fact that some survey platforms require costs, some of them don't. However, there are inevitably costs that come up that one might not necessarily think about in the beginning. And so it's always important, as I mentioned, to plan and think ahead of what costs could be involved.
Those are really good points, Ruth. Another thing to consider is sometimes you just might not have access to equipment, lab space, or you might even have a limited time window to sample a population. Maybe you're sampling finches that only are in your region in spring. In that case, don't plan for a winter sample. To address these issues, as Ruth mentioned, planning is key. Really think about these issues. And when it comes to lab equipment and lab space, really make friends with your lab assistant and your lab manager. They're going to know what the timetables look like and be able to help you navigate the stresses of that. I've worked with people in microbiology labs, and I know competition is fierce. Another way that you can mitigate these is, and it's a last resort because it's costly, is you can seek research assistants to help you with data collection, particularly if you're doing field work where you're going out to multiple locations. The downside to this is you have to trust your research assistants to collect the data in the right format. So keep in mind, it is a last resort. So the third limitation that frequently comes up is sample size or representativeness. And this is, again, another limitation that's key to much research. Ruth, what can we do to prevent this from causing problems?
So you're right. Sample size is a major issue. However, I think it's important to distinguish between qualitative and quantitative research in this regard. So in terms of qualitative research, ideally what you're looking for is representativeness of your sample as opposed to having a large sample size. So if you, for example, are looking for the experiences of Black or Hispanic or Chinese women in terms of their childbirth processes, it's not going to help if you interview white women. And so in that case, it's less to do with how many people you interview as opposed to the kind of people you interview and how knowledgeable they are and how much they can help add to your topic. So in qualitative research, keep in mind that the goal is not to generalize because you're trying to explore the lived experiences of individuals in that moment. And so you, of course, want to make sure that the people that you interview reflect or are representative of the topic that you're researching. However, it's not necessarily important to have the biggest sample size possible. However, when it comes to quantitative research, bigger is always better. You want as large a sample size as possible because of the fact that a larger sample size gives a better indication of the population, especially if you're trying to generalize about this. So sometimes what happens, though, when it comes to research is that you plan for a large sample size and that just doesn't happen. So you might, for example, have advertised and had people sign up for your study, and last minute they just don't arrive. Keep in mind, research is a dynamic process. People are participating voluntarily for the most part, and sometimes they just can't make it. And so it's possible that that happens where you just don't get the sample size you wanted. And keep in mind that, unfortunately, when you're doing quantitative research, this lack of large sample size can affect your statistical results, in the sense that it can affect your power or the confidence that you have in the results that you produce. So sometimes it does happen that you have a lower sample size than possible, which is less than ideal. But again, as far as possible, try and comment on, or at least report on, why this happened.
I think that's a great point. I mean, as an example from my own PhD work, at one point I had to scrap 2 or 3 experimental runs of my experiment. The story is 3 days into a 30-day trial, I got given a day's notice that they were going to fumigate our office space. And I was working with ants, so obviously that was not a good situation. So the ants died, I lost a replicate, but it's important to keep that in mind, that these things happen. So you have to be willing to shift and change. And sometimes it might mean you have to delay that data collection point that you really hope to get.
Absolutely. And I think the best way, as you said, to accommodate for this is to plan in advance as far as possible. I mean, a similar story was a researcher I know of who was doing research in polymer sciences, and the building caught fire while she was busy with the research. Sometimes you cannot account for everything that's happening. However, if you can plan in advance and try and plan for as large a sample size as possible, you can potentially help mitigate some of these issues that come up. So as I mentioned previously, there is a tool called G-Power, which essentially helps you determine the best possible sample size for what you need to do with your research. That'll help you determine the sample size that would be ideal for your study. Also, check out what's being done in other research and other literature. So sometimes you might think you need a sample size of 500 people, but if you look at your topic and you look at your field, sometimes it can be evident that maybe a sample size of 80 or 50 or 100 is actually perfectly sufficient. So use previous literature as a guide in terms of the sample size that you actually need. And crucially, always try and oversample than undersample. If you need a sample size, a final sample size of 100 people, for example, try and sample 120, 130, 140 people. Because if it so happens that during the process these people drop out or there's issues with the data, then you are working with the lower end of a goal as opposed to the absolute minimum that you can have. So always just try and sample more than you need as far as possible, so that you're not ending up with a very, very small sample size, which can, of course, impact the confidence that we have in your results. However, sometimes we cannot plan for this. So if, for example, you're using probability sampling, again, always check this with your supervisor because or your committee. You don't want to end up getting into trouble for this. But if, for example, you're using probability sampling, consider possibly supplementing your research strategy with non-probability sampling. This will just help you get your sample size up and increase the number of people you have that you can research with. Mixed methods is a unique topic on its own, but sometimes it's possible that if you are doing quantitative research, that there's a possibility for adding qualitative research as a supplement to this. So again, speak to your supervisor, or your chair, or your committee and see what they think. But if it so happens that your sample size is not what you anticipated, consider these things as supplements to ensure that your sample size in the context of quantitative research is big enough, and in the context of qualitative research that your sample is representative enough.
I think those are great points. And an important point to keep in mind is, again, as we said, you can't control for every limitation. So when you are identifying these limitations in your study, make sure to think about how it will affect your interpretation of your results. From a quantitative perspective, if your sample size is too small, you'll have to adjust your confidence in your findings. If, for instance, you're doing qualitative research and you don't have a very representative population, you need to discuss that might introduce bias. Again, being critical is better. The other thing I can say is, in any of these cases, it's better to own up to these limitations and soften your language to be more tentative rather than hushing it up. So, for instance, you can say, due to the smaller sample size, the generalizability of these results is not certain. However, we did find the following. And it really is just setting that scene that we're aware of the limitations, but this is what we found. And that's showing criticality again, which is super important in your dissertation or thesis. So our fourth limitation that frequently comes up, and again, this is a limitation that everyone has to deal with, is research design or methodological limitations. Ruth, how do we account for this? What do we do?
I think the most important thing to first keep in mind is that there is no one size fits all methodology. So, regardless of the kind of research that you're doing, you will choose a methodology that best aligns with your aims, your objectives, your research questions. Whether that is qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods, it's not possible to use every possible methodology that exists to answer the research question. And so, what that simply means is that whichever methodology you choose, even if you choose the methodology that is best suited to your topic, there will be limitations associated with it. Survey research, for example, is a really great methodological option because it allows you to capture the opinions and thoughts of a large number of people at one point in time. However, because of the fact that majority of survey research has closed ended questions, you are limited in the amount of expression that participants can have relating to the topic. So it's a great tool, however, there's those limitations. For example, then, if you're going to do qualitative research and you're going to do interviews, interviews are great for creating deep, rich, detailed data. However, it can be very time consuming depending on the person you're interviewing, depending on how well you can access that individual. It means that there's going to be a lot of data to interpret. It likely means your sample size can't be very big. And so then in that case, even if the goal of qualitative research is not to generalize, it means that you cannot necessarily gain a large amount of responses on your topic. So just those two examples, because I know they're very common in our research that we do, is that although they have their strengths, there are also weaknesses associated with them. And that is okay because of the fact that no research methodology can account for everything.
Those are great points, Ruth. I think it's important to note that even analysis techniques have their own limitations. For example, a thematic analysis helps you provide that rich data, but you're not going to get the experience of the person through as you would with phenomenological data. Similarly, as well, experimental approaches allows you to really control so many of the potential variables that might affect the result. So you can be sure that you're testing what you'd like to. But then it often comes up, is that really representative of how it might be in the greater world? It's also important to note that even statistical tests have their own requirements and assumptions, and these must be met. There are some where you can relax that assumption, but it's really important to know what those limitations are, what type of data you can use, and then choose the right statistical test for it. As Ruth was saying, there is no one correct answer, but it's important to pick the right approach for your research question.
Absolutely. And I think what's super important to keep in mind is that many of these limitations cannot be avoided because of the fact that, as we said, there is no one size fits all methodological approach. And so, whichever technique or approach you choose, whether it comes to your methodology or your analysis, it's just important that you justify what you did and why you did it. So, you are going to explain that given the context of your study, for example, a purely experimental in a laboratory setting was the most appropriate, or a phenomenological study with X amount of people was most appropriate. It's more about how you justify the decisions that you made than it is trying to account for every possible outcome or every possible methodology. And so when you do that, though, you are aware of the limitations of your technique and how this will affect your findings and your results. So once again, you're not dragging your own study through the mud by saying, I chose an experimental technique, whereas perhaps someone else chose a phenomenological technique, you're saying, based on what I wanted to do, an experimental technique was the best choice. However, I recognize that, for example, external validity might be compromised because I cannot necessarily replicate this in the real world. If you chose a qualitative approach, you might say, well, this was the best option that I had. However, I did not get to sample every single Hispanic or African or pregnant woman in the world. And therefore, I have to acknowledge the fact that my sample size limited my representativeness of the results. One way to mitigate this is to have a look and see what previous research has done. Previous research is always your best bet in terms of figuring out the best way to go with these things. So see what other people have done. Also, you do not have to reinvent the wheel. If majority of studies on your particular topic used a survey methodology, for example, because they wanted to get the opinions of the majority of America or the majority of South Africa, you can use that as justification for the fact that you chose that. You do not have to go and try and recreate an entire new methodology to get to the same point. Remember, research builds on itself. And so what has been published and what has been accepted as credible research is a good starting point for figuring out where you want to go with your research.
So our fifth and final limitation, and this is something that we can't really change, is that there is limitations in research experience and researcher bias. Ruth, we're not all experienced researchers. How do we address this while doing research?
I think the first important thing to acknowledge is the fact that the majority of us doing research are not postdoc or professors or highly esteemed researchers. And so for the most part, we do have limited experience regarding our research or our methodologies, and also bias does play a role. And I think acknowledging that as a starting point is really important because we're not pretending as though we don't have this limitation. And so it's possible we might miss literature. We might miss literature because we couldn't access it or because there wasn't a language we couldn't access, as mentioned before. We might make mistakes when collecting data. There are a number of reasons why things can go wrong. But I think crucially for this point, and this is even more important than before, is we want to acknowledge the fact that perhaps there were limitations in our own abilities and biases. However, we did not want to convey the idea that we simply did poor research because we didn't know any better. Because the second you say to an examiner that I did not know what I was doing, doubt is cast across all the work that you have produced. So I think crucially what you need to do here is, especially in the context of qualitative research, is we acknowledge the fact that subjectivity and bias plays a role. So what we do in qualitative research is we have a section regularly on reflexivity. And so we acknowledge the fact that within qualitative research, we are subjective beings as part of subjective context of research. We acknowledge the fact that even if the participants are not known to us, there is still an interpersonal relationship that occurs as a result of data collection. And so at the end of the study, you'll see often in published papers, the reflexivity section addresses the fact of how our potential limited experience and or bias will impact this. And the beauty of that is that you're not casting doubt on the quality of your research. However, you're acknowledging the fact that, for example, I, as a white female, was researching white females. Perhaps I unduly influenced the way they responded. Whereas had I been a non-white individual researching women or men who are not white, it may have had a different outcome. And so it's crucial to include that section where you reflect critically, because again, remember, critical reflection is what's important here. You're not saying that your study was trash. You're simply acknowledging where perhaps your own influence played a role. And therefore you are mitigating, in a sense, the possible impacts of the subjectivity of qualitative research. David, I know you've got a lot more to say on the quantitative side of things.
Always. So, I mean, it's important to note from a quantitative perspective, the assumption is we are coming to the study with an objective view. So we are not expecting anything. We have hypotheses based on the data, but when you're collecting data, we don't want to be fudging the data to suit your specific focus. So it's important to, first of all, practice or pilot your research approach. There's nothing wrong with doing a trial run for an experimental approach or an interview. Then after that, if you find there are issues, talk to your supervisor, reach out to people in your research group. There is nothing wrong with asking for help. And you'll find more often than not, everyone is willing to help out because they were in the same place. So it's really important to keep that in mind. You can also look at how you can work around some of these issues. For instance, if you are doing research in an experimental approach and you're worried that you're introducing bias through, for instance, if you're watching fish startle response and you're in the room, you can remove yourself from the room by having an automatic startle response initiator. So there are things we can do, and you'll find more often than not, previous research has already identified a lot of these aspects. So we always talk about it. We're standing on the shoulders of giants. We really are learning from what has come before to push research just a little bit further. Another important point to bring up in quantitative research is no significance is still a significant result.
Absolutely.
We don't want to not report results just because they are not significant. It's also important to consider alternative explanations for your findings. Maybe there's a relationship between two variables that can be positive, negative, or absent. But because of the way you've been reading the literature, you're only expecting a positive outcome. You might think that it's a problem with your design when it's actually just that is the relationship in your research context. It's also really important, and if it's ethically sound, get a second or third opinion. So talk to a friend, talk to another researcher, say, this is what I'm seeing in my data. Do you get to the same outcome as I do? Most people are really happy to give their opinion, so you're not going to struggle there. But just, again, make sure you're looking after your data and remaining ethically sound. We don't want to be making any of our participants' anonymity be challenged. So really be careful here, but there's lots of ways around this. Again, your supervisor or researcher chair is a great person to turn to.
Absolutely. What I have found in my own experience is that sometimes speaking about your results, especially if you're doing quantitative research, as a general finding, can be very helpful, especially if you're talking to someone who's not in your field. So if I were to say, David, 90% of my participants felt X, Y, and Z. Does this make sense to you? You're not compromising anonymity in any way. Of course, you need to make sure that you're not breaking any limitations in terms of anonymity with your own university. But if you are able to talk about your findings in a broad scale with a colleague, it can be very helpful to get that feedback and find out whether or not perhaps you are missing something crucial. And so I agree with you. Getting that second or third opinion, if ethically possible, is a very, very good way to ensure that you are not necessarily reading into or applying bias where none should be present.
I think those are really great points. So Ruth, thank you so much for joining us today. As always, we really value your ideas and opinions.
Thanks, David. It was so great to be here, as always.
All right, so that pretty much wraps up this episode of Grad Coach TV. Remember, for more information about the limitations or research in general, be sure to head over to the Grad Coach blog at gradcoach.com/blog. There you can also get access to our free dissertation and thesis writing mini course, which gives you all you need to get started on your research journey. Also, if you're looking for a helping hand with your dissertation or thesis, be sure to check out our one-on-one private coaching service, where you can work with one of our friendly coaches, just like Ruth. For all the information you need and to book a free consultation with one of our coaches, be sure to check out our website, gradcoach.com.